Lazy Maid's first day at work, she accidentally sleeps in the Billionaire's room. Hi, my beautiful family. Welcome back to Mr. Peter Stories. Before we begin today's story, I'd like to say a prayer for those who are not feeling well. May you feel the warmth of love wrap around you, and may your heart be healed with the tender touch of peace. May your strength return, and your pain be replaced with light. You are never alone in your struggles, and better days are ahead. I'm sending you all my love and prayers for a speedy recovery. Today, my heart is heavy, and I find it so hard to speak these words, but I have to be honest with you. I've been putting my whole heart into these stories, working tirelessly to bring you all something special, something meaningful. But day after day, I've seen the response slowly fading. More and more of my loyal family members are leaving, and it hurts so deeply. I want you to know I have only one channel, Mr. Peter Stories. There are no fake channels, no other accounts claiming to be me. I'm here with you, and I am only here for you. If this continues, if the love and support keep fading, I honestly don't know how much longer I can keep going. Writing these stories, sharing my heart with you, is something I've always loved. But if there's no response, if I'm not reaching you, I don't know how to keep going. This is not easy for me to say, but I need to be real with you all. My heart is breaking, and today we proceed with a heavy heart, unsure of what the future holds. Please, I need you now more than ever. The morning sun cast long shadows across Manhattan's steel and glass canyons as Freya Ruby stood before the towering headquarters of Bark Industries. Her hands trembled slightly as she clutched her cleaning supplies, the plastic bucket's handle digging into her palm. The gleaming 100-story building seemed to touch the clouds, its windows reflecting the golden sunrise like thousands of burning stars. At 25, this wasn't where Freya had imagined she'd be. Just 3 months ago, she'd been preparing for the grand opening of her dream dance studio in Brooklyn. Now the studio was nothing but ashes and insurance paperwork, and she was starting her first day as a cleaning lady in the city's most prestigious corporate tower. The early autumn wind whipped around the building's corner, catching her dark curls and making her shiver in her newly purchased uniform. The polyester material felt stiff and foreign against her skin, nothing like the soft practice leotards she used to wear. She took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. This was temporary, she reminded herself, just until she could save enough to rebuild. The lobby's marble floor gleamed like polished midnight, her sensible shoes squeaking slightly as she approached the security desk. The guard, a middle-aged man with salt and pepper hair and tired eyes, barely glanced at her newly minted ID badge before waving her toward the service elevator. "New girl, huh?" he muttered, already turning back to his newspaper. "Remember, service entrance only, and don't even think about using the executive elevators." Freya nodded, clutching her ID card like a lifeline as she made her way to the back of the lobby. The service elevator's brushed steel doors were a stark contrast to the elegant glass and chrome of the main elevators. As she stepped inside, the harsh fluorescent lighting made her wince, highlighting the dark circles under her eyes from another sleepless night, worrying about bills. Her supervisor's orientation the previous evening had been brief and to the point. Clean the executive floors between 5 a.m. and 8 a.m. before the corporate world awakened. Don't disturb anything on the desks. Don't enter any closed offices without explicit permission. And above all else, never, under any circumstances, enter the penthouse office or private quarters of King Bark, the notorious CEO of Bark Industries. The elevator's ancient mechanisms groaned as it carried her upward. Freya leaned against the wall, exhaustion seeping into her bones. Her shift at the diner had run late last night, a rowdy bachelor party that couldn't take a hint about closing time. 3 hours of sleep wasn't nearly enough, but she couldn't afford to turn down double shifts. not with the studio's debts still hanging over her head. The executive floors were eerily quiet at this hour. Freya's footsteps were muffled by thick carpeting as she pushed her cleaning cart from office to office. The morning light was growing stronger now, streaming through floor-to-ceiling windows and illuminating spectacular views of the city below. She found herself pausing occasionally, imagining what it would be like to work in one of these corner offices, to be one of the power players whose names graced the elegant door plaques. By the time she reached the final floor in her assigned section, her arms ached from scrubbing and dusting. The executive bathrooms were her last task, all chrome and black marble, more luxurious than most hotel suites. As she finished polishing the last mirror, fatigue hit her like a physical wave. She'd been on her feet for nearly 20 hours straight between both jobs. "Just need to find the service elevator," she mumbled to herself, wheeling her cart into the hallway. But in her exhausted state, the identical corridors began to blur together. Was it left at the water cooler, or right at the conference room? The plush carpet continued to muffle her footsteps as she pushed open yet another heavy mahogany door, hoping to find a familiar landmark. Instead, she found herself in what appeared to be a bedroom suite. The space was massive, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a breathtaking view of Central Park. A king-sized bed dominated one wall, its charcoal grey bedding looking impossibly inviting. A leather armchair sat in one corner beside a small table, holding what appeared to be case files and a half-empty glass of whiskey. Freya knew she should leave immediately, but exhaustion made her thoughts fuzzy. The room was clearly private quarters, probably for executives who worked late or needed to freshen up between meetings. She'd just rest her eyes for 5 minutes, she decided, sinking into the armchair. 5 minutes, and then she'd find her way back to the service elevator. The sound of a throat clearing jolted her awake. Sunlight was streaming through the windows at a different angle now. How long had she been asleep? But that thought vanished as she registered the man standing in the doorway. King Bark's reputation preceded him throughout New York's business world. At 35, he'd built Bark Industries from nothing into a global empire, earning himself a fortune and a nickname as the Wolf of Wall Street's new generation. But reputation hadn't prepared Freya for the reality of his presence. He filled the doorway with his 6'4" frame, broad shoulders emphasized by an impeccably tailored charcoal suit. His steel-gray eyes studied her with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. Dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged on magazine covers, which, she remembered with a jolt of panic, it frequently was. But it was the slight quirk of his lips that terrified her most. Was that amusement or anger in his expression? "This is certainly not how I expected to find someone in my private quarters," he said, his deep voice sending involuntary shivers down her spine. The words were calm, almost conversational, but there was an underlying edge of authority that made her pulse race. Freya scrambled to her feet, nearly knocking over the small table in her haste. The case files slid precariously close to the edge, and she grabbed them reflexively before they could fall. "Mr. Bark, I'm so sorry. I got lost, and I was so tired. I know it's not an excuse, but please, I really need this job." His eyes flickered to the files in her hands, then back to her face. She realized with horror that she was holding what were probably confidential documents. "I didn't read anything," she added quickly, setting them carefully back on the table. He moved into the room with a predator's fluid grace, and Freya found herself backing up until her legs hit the armchair. "You know my name," he observed, "but I don't know yours." "Freya Ruby, sir." Her voice came out steadier than she expected. "It's my first day." "First and last, I'd imagine," he said, but something in his tone didn't match the harsh words. His eyes were still studying her face with that unnerving intensity, as though she were a puzzle he was trying to solve. "Unless..." He paused, and in that moment, Freya found herself holding her breath. The morning sun caught the silver at his temples, and she noticed that his eyes weren't just grey, they had flecks of blue, like storm clouds over the ocean. He was close enough now that she could smell his cologne, something expensive and subtle, with notes of cedar and amber. "Unless what, sir?" she asked when the silence stretched too long, surprising herself with her boldness. A smile tugged at one corner of his mouth, a real one this time, not the sardonic quirk from before. It transformed his entire face, softening the sharp edges and making him look younger, more approachable. "Unless," he said slowly, "you can convince me why I shouldn't." Freya lifted her chin, drawing on the last reserves of her courage. She could feel the weight of this moment, the way it balanced on a knife's edge between disaster and something else, something unexpected. "Because I made a mistake," she said honestly, "but I'm not a mistake. I work hard, I learn quickly, and I don't make the same error twice." His eyebrows rose slightly at her response, and for a heartbeat, she thought she saw something like approval in his expression. Then he moved to his desk, his back to her, as he looked out over the awakening city. "Tell me, Miss Ruby, what brought you to Bark Industries?" The question felt like a test, though she couldn't guess the right answer, but something told her that honesty was her only chance. "Necessity, sir. I owned a dance studio in Brooklyn until 3 months ago. There was a fire. Insurance wouldn't cover it because of a technicality in the building's age. I need this job to pay off the debts and eventually rebuild." He turned back to face her, and the intensity of his gaze made her feel like she was the only person in the world. "A dancer," he said softly, almost to himself. Then, louder, "That explains the grace. Even exhausted and terrified, you move like music is playing." Freya felt heat rise to her cheeks at the unexpected compliment. Thank you, sir." "I have a reputation, Ms. Ruby," he continued, moving closer again. "They call me ruthless, unforgiving, a wolf in an expensive suit. Do you know why I've succeeded where others failed?" She shook her head, not trusting her voice as he approached. "Because I recognize opportunities when they present themselves, even when they arrive in unexpected packages." He paused, just arm's length away. "So here's what's going to happen. You're going to go home and get some proper sleep. Then you're going to return tomorrow morning at 8 a.m. sharp, dressed appropriately for an office environment. My previous personal assistant quit last week, and I find myself in need of someone with initiative." Freya's mind spun as she processed his words. "But sir, I don't have any experience as a personal assistant." "No," he agreed, that almost smile playing at his lips again. "But you have something more valuable. Character. And grace under pressure, apparently. The question is, Ms. Ruby, are you brave enough to accept?" The sun had fully risen now, bathing the office in golden light. Freya looked up at King Bark, this man who held her future in his hands, who could destroy her with a word or lift her up with another. His eyes challenged her, dared her to take this leap into the unknown. "Yes," she heard herself say, "yes, I accept." His smile broadened, and for a moment it felt like the sun had gotten brighter. "Excellent. Oh, and Ms. Ruby." "Yes, sir." "Next time you need a nap, use the executive lounge on the 80th floor. The chairs there are much more comfortable." As Freya left the office on shaking legs, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life had just changed irrevocably. What she couldn't know, was that King Bark watched her go with an expression of fascinated interest that would have shocked anyone who knew him. For the first time in years, the Wolf of Wall Street had found something more intriguing than the next big deal. The game was about to change for both of them, and it all started with one fateful mistake. Chapter 2. An unusual proposition. King Bark stood at his office window watching the morning sun paint golden streaks across Manhattan's skyline. In 20 years of business, he'd learned to trust his instincts. Those same instincts had helped him build Bark Industries from a small tech startup into a global empire. Now they were telling him something entirely unexpected about the woman he'd found asleep in his private quarters. He turned from the window, his eyes falling on the leather armchair where she'd been curled up just moments ago. Something about her lingered in the space, perhaps the ghost of her floral perfume, or the way the morning light had caught the gold undertones in her dark skin. He couldn't explain the impulse that had made him pause, that had stopped him from immediately calling security. Something about Freya Ruby intrigued him. Perhaps the quiet dignity in her bearing despite her obvious embarrassment, or the fierce determination in her dark eyes. The intercom buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. "Mr. Bark, your 9 a.m. is here," his temporary assistant announced. "Cancel it," he replied, making a decision. "Cancel everything until noon and get me everything you can find on Freya Ruby and her dance studio." Walking to his desk, King picked up the case files she'd caught before they could fall. He'd seen the way her dancer's reflexes had kicked in, the fluid grace of her movement, even in that moment of panic. More importantly, he'd seen the way she'd immediately set the files down without so much as a glance at their contents. Integrity wasn't something that could be taught. It was either there or it wasn't. His phone buzzed with an incoming message. The preliminary background check revealed exactly what she'd told him. Ownership of a small dance studio in Brooklyn, destroyed by fire 3 months ago. The insurance company's rejection of her claim was buried in legal jargon, but the essence was clear. They'd found a technicality to avoid paying. His jaw tightened. He'd seen this story before, big companies crushing small business owners. Under the weight of fine print, a deeper search revealed more. Glowing reviews of her dance classes, newspaper clippings about community outreach programs she'd run for underprivileged kids, a small but devoted following on social media where she shared dance tutorials. No criminal record, excellent credit until the fire, 2 jobs to make ends meet. Everything pointed to someone who worked hard and played by the rules. King's lips curved into a slight smile. He'd built his reputation on taking calculated risks, and something told him this one might be worth taking. The morning passed in a blur of meetings and phone calls, but his mind kept drifting back to those few minutes in his private quarters. He'd seen something in Freya's eyes when she stood her ground, a spark of fire beneath the fear. It reminded him of himself at that age, fighting to make his mark in a world that had written him off. At precisely 8 a.m. the next morning, his intercom buzzed again. "Sir, Ms. Ruby is here. Send her in." The woman who walked through his door was a transformation from yesterday's exhausted cleaning lady. Freya had managed to find a simple but elegant black dress that suited her perfectly, her dark curls tamed into a professional updo. But it was her bearing that caught his attention. She held herself like a dancer despite her obvious nervousness, chin high and shoulders back. "Good morning, Mr. Bark," she said, her voice steady despite the slight tremor he noticed in her hands. "Please, sit." He gestured to the chair across from his desk, studying her reaction as she took in the magnificent view behind him. There was appreciation in her expression, but not the awe or greed he'd seen in so many others. "Interesting. I suppose," he continued, "we should discuss exactly what I'm proposing." Freya met his gaze directly. "That would be helpful, sir. I'm still not entirely sure why I'm here instead of cleaning floors." The corner of his mouth twitched. "Direct. I like that." He leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie slightly. "Tell me, Ms. Ruby, do you know what the most valuable commodity in my world is?" She considered for a moment. "Time? Close? Trust?" He stood, moving to pour 2 cups of coffee from the expensive machine in the corner. "I can buy time. I can buy talent. I can buy almost anything except trust." He handed her one of the cups, noting how she wrapped her elegant fingers around its warmth. "Yesterday, You had unrestricted access to confidential documents for who knows how long. You didn't look at them. Why? Because they weren't mine to look at, she answered simply. King nodded, sitting on the edge of his desk rather than returning to his chair. The move put him closer to her, and he noticed the slight catch in her breath at his proximity. Exactly. Do you know how rare that kind of integrity is in my world, Miss Ruby? She looked up at him, and for a moment, he was struck by the depth of her dark eyes. About as rare as billionaires offering jobs to sleeping maids? A genuine laugh escaped him. Another rarity. Touché. He took a sip of his coffee, gathering his thoughts. My last personal assistant quit rather suddenly last week. The official story is that she's pursuing other opportunities. The reality is that I caught her selling information to our competitors. Freya's expression darkened. That's terrible. That's business, he corrected. Or at least, that's what everyone keeps telling me. But I don't accept that. I need someone I can trust. Someone who understands the value of loyalty, not because they signed an NDA, but because it's part of who they are. And you think that's me, based on one incident? I think, he said slowly, that you're someone who built something from nothing once before. Someone who understands that real success comes from hard work and integrity, not cutting corners. He paused, studying her reaction. I also think you're someone who deserves a second chance at their dreams. Her eyes widened slightly. You looked into me. Of course I did. I know about the studio, about the insurance company's decision, about the community classes you ran for kids who couldn't afford lessons. He saw the flash of pain cross her face at the mention of her lost business. I know you're working 2 jobs to pay off debts that aren't really yours to bear. Those kids, she said softly, they were everything. Some of them had never had anyone believe in them before, to see them discover what they could do, to watch them grow. She trailed off, emotion making her voice thick. King felt something stir in his chest, an unfamiliar sensation of wanting to ease someone else's pain. That's exactly why I want you for this position. You understand what it means to build something meaningful, not just profitable. He stood, walking to the window, the city spread out below them like a concrete kingdom. The job won't be easy. You'll need to learn fast, work harder than you ever have, and deal with people who will resent your presence. The hours are long, the pressure is intense, and you'll have to handle everything from million-dollar contracts to my dry cleaning. Why me? She asked quietly. Surely there are countless qualified candidates. King turned back to face her, struck again by the grace in her bearing even when seated. Because qualified candidates are easy to find. People with genuine integrity are not. He moved closer, noticing how she had to tilt her head back to maintain eye contact. I'm offering you a chance, Ms. Ruby. What you do with it is up to you. Freya stood, bringing them face to face. This close, he could see the golden flecks in her dark eyes, smell the subtle hint of jasmine in her perfume. And what about my cleaning position? Consider this a promotion. The salary is significantly better, I assure you. I can't quit the diner, she said firmly. I have obligations. King felt his respect for her tick up another notch. Most people would have jumped at the chance to leave their second job behind. We can work around your schedule until you're ready to make the change. She was quiet for a long moment, and he could almost see her mind working through the possibilities, the risks, the potential rewards. Finally, she squared her shoulders. I accept, on one condition. His eyebrows rose. You're negotiating with me already. A small smile played at her lips. Consider it demonstrating initiative, sir. Very well. Your condition? I want to learn, not just how to be a good assistant, but how this world works. If I'm going to rebuild my studio someday, I need to understand business at this level. King felt a smile tugging at his own lips. She was already thinking ahead, already planning her next move. Perfect. Deal. We'll start with the basics of corporate finance. I expect you to study in whatever free time you can find. Thank you, Mr. Bark. King, he corrected. If you're going to be my right hand, we can dispense with the formalities in private. Something flickered in her eyes at the word private, a hint of awareness that made his pulse quicken slightly. King, she repeated, testing the name on her tongue. The moment stretched between them, charged with something neither of them was ready to name. Finally, King stepped back, breaking the spell. Report to HR for paperwork, then come back here. Your first lesson in corporate politics will be handling the fallout from your unexpected promotion. Freya nodded, gathering her purse. At the door, she paused. Why did you really hire me? King met her gaze steadily. Because when I found you in my room that day, you didn't try to flatter or seduce your way out of trouble. You were honest, even when it could have cost you everything. He smiled slightly. That, and anyone who can fall asleep in a billionaire's private quarters, has the kind of nerves this job requires. Her laugh was unexpected and musical, lighting up her entire face. I'll try to stay awake from now on. See that you do, he replied, but his tone was warm. As she left, King returned to his window, watching the city below. He'd built his empire on instinct and calculated risks. This might be his biggest gamble yet, but something told him Freya Ruby was going to surprise everyone, himself included. The morning sun caught the buildings across the street, sending ribbons of light dancing through his office. Somewhere in Brooklyn, an empty dance studio waited for rebirth, and in a penthouse office high above Manhattan, two people from very different worlds had just taken the first steps of a dance neither of them saw coming. The game was changing, and King Bark, for the first time in years, found himself looking forward to seeing what the next move would be. He touched the arm of the chair where she'd slept, a small smile playing at his lips. Sometimes the best business decisions were the ones that made no sense on paper. Time would tell if he was right about Freya Ruby. But as he turned back to his desk, already planning her training schedule in his mind, King had to admit he was looking forward to finding out. Chapter 3. Walking a Tightrope. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to paint the sky when Freya stepped out of the elevator onto the executive floor. 3 weeks had passed since her unexpected promotion, and each day felt like dancing on a knife's edge. Her heels clicked softly against the marble floors as she made her way to King's office, already reviewing the day's schedule in her mind. The cleaning staff, her former colleagues, were just finishing their morning routine. A few nodded to her, but most averted their eyes. She couldn't blame them. Her rise from cleaning lady to executive assistant had set tongues wagging throughout the building. The whispers followed her everywhere. Gold digger, opportunist, sleeping her way to the top. But Freya held her head high, remembering the grace her mother had taught her long ago. Let them talk, she'd said. Your actions will speak louder than their words. King's office was dark when she arrived, but that didn't surprise her. She'd quickly learned his habits. He rarely came in before 9, preferring to work late into the night instead. It gave her time to prepare, to transform into the composed professional he needed her to be. She set his coffee to brew, Colombian roast, black, and began organizing the files for his morning meetings. Her fingers traced the edge of a particularly complex merger proposal, remembering how he'd spent hours the previous evening explaining the intricacies of corporate acquisitions. He was a demanding teacher, but a surprisingly patient one. Already hard at work, I see. Freya jumped slightly at the sound of his voice. King stood in the doorway, his tie loosened and jacket slung over one shoulder. The morning light caught the silver at his temples, and she noticed dark circles under his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. You're early, she observed, already moving to pour his coffee. The Anderson meeting isn't until 10. Couldn't sleep. He accepted the cup with a grateful nod, their fingers brushing briefly in the exchange. How's the studying coming along? Freya smiled, retrieving her notebook from her desk. I think I'm starting to understand the basics of corporate finance, though I have questions about the leveraged buyout strategy you mentioned yesterday. King's eyes lit up with approval. He loved it when she asked questions, when she showed genuine interest in learning his world. Setting down his coffee, he moved to stand beside her at the desk, leaning in to look at her notes. His cologne, that familiar blend of cedar and amber, wrapped around her, making it hard to concentrate. "Show me what you're struggling with," he said, his voice low and close to her ear. Freya forced herself to focus on the numbers, not on the warmth radiating from his proximity. "Here," she pointed to a calculation. "I understand the concept of using debt to acquire a company, but the risk factors seem..." She trailed off as he reached past her to grab a pen, his chest brushing against her shoulder. For a moment, neither of them moved, caught in the charged silence of the morning light. Then King cleared his throat softly and stepped back, maintaining a professional distance. "The risk factors are what make it interesting," he said, his voice slightly rougher than usual. "Here, let me show you." The next hour passed in a blur of financial terms and strategic planning. King was in his element, breaking down complex concepts into digestible pieces. Freya found herself mesmerized not just by the lesson, but by the passion with which he taught it. This was a different side of him than the ruthless businessman the media portrayed. Here was someone who genuinely loved the intricacies of his work. Their impromptu lesson was interrupted by the arrival of the morning's first crisis. Sarah from legal burst in without knocking, her face pale. "Mr. Bark, we have a situation with the Tokyo deal." King straightened immediately, the teacher vanishing behind the mask of the CEO. "What happened?" "The Japanese partners are threatening to pull out. They're saying the terms changed without their approval." Freya watched as King's expression hardened. "Get me the contract, now." The next few hours were a masterclass in crisis management. Freya observed in silent awe as King navigated the complex web of international business relationships. He switched effortlessly between English and Japanese, his voice remaining calm and authoritative even as millions of dollars hung in the balance. It wasn't until late afternoon that the crisis was finally resolved. King loosened his tie with a sigh of relief, running a hand through his usually immaculate hair. "Welcome to the real world of corporate finance," he said, with a wry smile. "That was..." Freya searched for the right word. "Incredible. The way you handled their concerns while still protecting the company's interests. You picked up on that, did you?" His smile widened slightly. "Good. That's the kind of detail you need to notice in this world." He glanced at his watch and frowned. "Shouldn't you be leaving for your shift at the diner?" Freya checked the time and jumped up. "Yes, I should. Will you need anything else before I go?" Something flickered in his eyes. Concern, perhaps. "You're working too hard, Freya. You can't keep burning the candle at both ends." "I'm fine," she assured him, gathering her things. "The diner isn't so bad, and I need the extra income until you can rebuild the studio," he finished softly. "I know, but don't let that dream cost you your health." Their eyes met across the office, and Freya felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. These moments of genuine concern from him were becoming more frequent, and they confused her more than his business lessons ever could. "I'll be careful," she promised. "Try to get some rest yourself. You look tired." His lips curved into a half smile. "Is that concern for my welfare, Ms. Ruby?" "Professional concern only, Mr. Bark," she replied primly, but her own smile betrayed her. "Can't have the CEO falling asleep in board meetings." His low chuckle followed her to the door. Freya? She turned back. Yes. Good work today, with everything. The praise warmed her more than it should have. Thank you, King. The diner was busy that night, a steady stream of customers keeping Freya on her feet until well past midnight. Her mind kept drifting back to the morning's lessons, to the way King's eyes had lit up when she'd asked intelligent questions. She was so lost in thought that she almost didn't notice when the bell above the door chimed at 15 minutes to closing. "We're about to close," she began automatically, turning toward the door. The words died in her throat. King stood in the entrance, looking impossibly out of place in his expensive suit. His eyes swept the nearly empty diner before landing on her, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "I was in the neighborhood," he said, though they both knew that was unlikely. This wasn't exactly his part of town. "Thought I might get a cup of coffee." Freya was acutely aware of her waitress uniform, of her hair escaping its ponytail after a long shift. But King was looking at her like none of that mattered, like she was still the polished professional from his office. "Coffee, huh?" She grabbed a menu more out of habit than necessity. "Any particular reason you needed coffee at midnight in Brooklyn?" He settled into a booth, his long legs stretching out beneath the table. "Would you believe me if I said I wanted to see where my assistant spends her evenings? I'd say that's a long way to come for curiosity." His eyes held hers. "Maybe I wanted to see you dance." Freya nearly dropped the coffee pot she was holding. "What?" "You move differently here," he observed, accepting the cup she poured with slightly shaking hands. "More freely, like music is playing even when it isn't." She hadn't realized he'd been watching her that closely. "Force of habit," she said softly. "I used to choreograph while I worked. It helped pass the time." "Show me." The request was quiet, but intense. Freya glanced around the empty diner, at the chairs already stacked on tables. "Here, now." "Why not?" He leaned back, those storm-grey eyes challenging her. "Show me what you lost in that fire. Show me why it matters so much." Maybe it was exhaustion making her bold. Or maybe it was the way he was looking at her, like she was a puzzle he was determined to solve. Whatever the reason, Freya found herself moving to the center of the diner floor. She closed her eyes, letting the familiar rhythm find her. When she danced, the world fell away. There was no lost studio, no mountain of debt, no complicated feelings for her boss. There was only the music in her head and the story her body could tell. The dance wasn't technically perfect. Her waitress shoes weren't made for pirouettes, and her uniform restricted some movements. But as she moved through the empty space, she poured everything into it. Her dreams, her fears, her determination to rebuild. When she finally stopped, she realized her cheeks were wet. King hadn't moved, but his expression had changed. The calculating businessman was gone, replaced by something softer, more vulnerable. "That's why," she whispered, answering his earlier question. "That's why I work 2 jobs. That's why I study finance at dawn and serve coffee at midnight, because when I dance, I'm free." King stood slowly, moving toward her with that fluid grace that still took her breath away. He stopped just out of arm's reach, but she could feel the heat of his presence. "Let me help you," he said quietly. "I can't accept charity." "Not charity." His voice was intense. "An investment in you, in your dream." Freya shook her head, even as her heart raced at his proximity. "Why would you do that?" "Because talent like yours shouldn't be serving coffee at midnight." He paused, then added softly, "And because you've shown me something I didn't expect to find in my world, pure passion, untainted by greed or ambition." They stood in silence, the weight of his offer hanging between them. Outside, a passing car's headlights swept across the diner windows, briefly illuminating them like actors on a stage. "I need to think about it," she finally said. He nodded, understanding in his eyes. Take your time. But Freya, yes. Don't let pride stand in the way of your dreams. Sometimes accepting help takes more courage than refusing it. With that, he laid a generous tip on the table and walked out into the night, leaving Freya standing in the empty diner with her heart pounding and her world tilted on its axis. Later that night, as she walked home through the quiet streets of Brooklyn, Freya couldn't stop thinking about the way King had looked at her while she danced, like he was seeing not just who she was, but who she could become. It was dangerous, this growing awareness between them. She was his assistant, nothing more. But as she climbed the stairs to her small apartment, she couldn't help remembering the warmth in his eyes, the sincerity in his offer to help. Perhaps the most dangerous part wasn't their growing closeness, but how right it felt. Tomorrow, she would return to the office, to the world of mergers and acquisitions, of power suits and boardroom battles. She would be the perfect professional assistant, ignoring the way her heart raced when he stood too close or smiled that rare, genuine smile. But tonight, in the privacy of her own thoughts, Freya admitted what she'd been trying to deny for weeks. She was falling for King Bark, and judging by the look in his eyes as he watched her dance, she might not be falling alone. The realization should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the beginning of a new dance, one with steps she was only starting to learn. Chapter 4. Dangerous Waters. Cleo Hamilton's Louboutin heels announced her arrival before she appeared, their distinctive click-clack echoing through the executive floor like warning shots. Freya straightened instinctively at her desk, preparing for the storm that was about to break. Manhattan's most celebrated socialite had been dating King on and off for the past 2 years, their relationship fodder for endless tabloid speculation. This morning, Cleo looked every inch the power player she was. Perfect auburn hair cascading in waves, a white Chanel suit that probably cost more than Freya's yearly rent, and eyes as cold as Arctic ice. Well, well, Cleo drawled, coming to a stop at Freya's desk. If it isn't Cinderella herself, though I suppose in your case it's more of a Sleeping Beauty story, isn't it? Freya met her gaze steadily, refusing to be baited. Good morning, Ms. Hamilton. I'm afraid Mr. Bark is in a meeting right now. Oh, I'm quite aware of his schedule. Cleo's perfectly manicured nails, blood red against the white of her suit, drummed against the desktop. After all, I used to have my assistant coordinate with his. Speaking of which, how are you finding your new role? It must be quite an adjustment, going from cleaning toilets to managing a corporate calendar. The implied insult rolled off Freya like water. She'd faced worse in her years of building her dance studio from nothing. I appreciate your concern, but I'm managing quite well. Would you like me to let Mr. Bark know you stopped by? Cleo's eyes narrowed at Freya's composed response. No need. I'll wait. Without invitation, she settled into one of the visitor chairs, crossing her legs in a deliberate display of designer fashion. We can have a little girl talk while I do. Freya returned her attention to her computer screen, trying to focus on the quarterly reports she was reviewing. But Cleo wasn't finished. You know, it's fascinating, really, she continued, her voice dripping with false sweetness. How quickly some people can rise and fall. One minute you're sleeping in the CEO's private quarters, the next you're his trusted assistant. It's like a modern fairy tale. Her red lips curved into a predatory smile, though fairy tales rarely end well for those who reach above their station. I prefer to let my work speak for itself, Freya replied evenly, though her heart was pounding. Oh, I'm sure you do excellent work. The pause was deliberate, loaded with insinuation. King always did have a soft spot for charity cases, though usually he sticks to writing checks rather than hiring them. Before Freya could respond, the conference room doors opened. King emerged, surrounded by board members, but his eyes found Freya immediately. His expression shifted subtly when he spotted Cleo, something dark flickering across his features. "Cleo," he said, his voice carefully neutral, "this is unexpected." She rose gracefully, moving to kiss his cheek with practiced familiarity. "Darling, I thought we could do lunch, discuss the charity gala next month." Her hand lingered on his arm, a clear message of possession. King stepped back slightly, maintaining professional distance. "I have a full schedule today. Freya, what's next?" "The Johnson merger presentation at 1, Freya replied promptly, followed by the quarterly review with finance at 3. "See? Completely booked." King moved toward his office, but Cleo followed, her heels clicking against the marble floor like strikes of a hammer. "The gala committee really needs your input, darling. Surely your assistant can reschedule something." She spat the word assistant like it was poison on her tongue. King paused in his doorway, turning to face her. "Cleo, we've discussed this. The Foundation's activities are being restructured, including the gala." "Restructured?" Cleo's voice rose slightly, a crack appearing in her perfect facade. "But the gala is the social event of the season. The committee has been planning for months and spending far too much on parties while accomplishing too little." King's tone was firm, brooking no argument. "The Foundation's new focus will be on practical assistance and education, starting with arts programs in underserved communities." Freya's head snapped up at this, her eyes meeting King's for a brief moment. She saw something there, a warmth that had nothing to do with business and everything to do with the late-night conversations they'd had about her former dance studio and the children she'd taught. Cleo didn't miss the exchange. Her perfect facade cracked further, real anger showing through. "I see. And I suppose this new direction was inspired by your Cinderella here? How convenient that the Foundation's new focus aligns so perfectly with her background." She practically spit the last word. "That's enough!" King's voice cut through the air like steel. "My office, now!" As the door closed behind them, Freya could hear their voices rising and falling, though the words were muffled. She tried not to listen, focusing instead on the presentation materials for the Johnson merger, but her mind kept drifting to King's words about the Foundation's new direction. Had she really influenced that decision? The argument ended with the sharp click of Cleo's heels and the slam of King's office door. She stormed past Freya's desk, but paused for one final shot. "You don't belong here," she hissed, leaning close enough that Freya could smell her expensive perfume. "Do you really think he sees you as anything more than a charity case, a little project to make himself feel good about his billions? Wake up, sweetheart. Men like King don't end up with girls who clean their toilets." Freya met her gaze calmly, though her heart was racing. "I belong exactly where my work ethic and abilities have placed me, Ms. Hamilton. Nothing more, nothing less." Cleo's perfectly painted lips curved into a cruel smile. "We'll see about that. You've made a powerful enemy today, little dancer, and I always get what I want." The threat hung in the air long after she'd gone, her heels clicking a deadly rhythm down the hallway. Freya sat at her desk, hands trembling slightly as she tried to return to her work. The worst part was that Cleo's words had hit close to home. They were the same doubts that kept her awake at night. "You handled that well." Freya jumped slightly. King stood in his office doorway, watching her with an unreadable expression. "I'm sorry if I caused problems between you and Ms. Hamilton," she said quietly. He moved to lean against her desk, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Cleo and I have been heading for a collision course for months. She represents an old way of thinking that doesn't align with where I want to take this company, or my life." Their eyes met, and Freya felt that now familiar flutter in her chest. "The Foundation's new direction," she said carefully. "Is that really because of me?" "You reminded me of something I'd forgotten," he admitted, his voice softening. That real change happens at the ground level, not at $1,000-a-plate galas. I've watched you build yourself up from nothing, seen how hard you work for your dreams. That's worth more than any inherited position or social connection." The sincerity in his voice made her throat tight. "Thank you," she whispered. "For what?" "For seeing me. The real me, not just where I came from." Something shifted in his expression, his eyes softening in a way that made her heart race. He reached out, his fingers brushing a loose curl from her cheek. The touch was feather-light, but it sent electricity coursing through her. "I see you, Freya," he said softly. "I've seen you since that first morning." The moment stretched between them, charged with possibility. Then the elevator dinged, announcing the arrival of more executives, and King straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. "The Johnson presentation," he said, voice returning to its business tone. "Walk me through your analysis." Freya grabbed her tablet, grateful for the return to familiar territory. But as she followed him into his office, she could still feel the ghost of his touch on her cheek, still see the warmth in his eyes when he'd said he saw her. Cleo's threats echoed in her mind, but they seemed less potent now. Because King had looked at her not with charity or pity, but with something that felt dangerously like admiration. Maybe even something more. The next few weeks brought more subtle attacks from Cleo. Misplaced files, whispered rumors in the break room, carefully orchestrated social snubs. But Freya weathered them all with quiet dignity, throwing herself into her work with renewed determination. King noticed, of course. He noticed everything about her these days, the way she anticipated his needs before he could voice them, the grace with which she handled difficult clients, the late hours she put in studying financial reports and business strategy. "You don't belong here," Cleo had said. But watching Freya masterfully navigate a crisis with their Tokyo partners, speaking to them in carefully practiced Japanese, King couldn't help but disagree. She belonged exactly where she was, by his side, challenging him, surprising him, making him see his world through new eyes. The realization should have worried him. Instead, it felt like waking up from a long sleep, like finding something he hadn't known he was missing. One evening, as they worked late reviewing foundation proposals, King found himself watching Freya instead of the documents before him. She sat in what had become her usual spot on his office sofa, heels kicked off, hair slightly mussed from running her fingers through it in concentration. She was beautiful, yes, but it was more than that. She radiated a quiet strength, an innate grace that had nothing to do with social status and everything to do with who she was at her core. "You're staring," she said without looking up from her tablet. "I'm thinking." Now she did look up, a smile playing at her lips. Dangerous pastime. Indeed. He moved to sit beside her, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her dark eyes. "I was thinking about what Cleo said." Freya's smile faded slightly. "Which part? About me seeing you as a charity case?" He turned to face her fully. "Do you believe that's true?" She was quiet for a long moment, considering. "No," she finally said, "I don't. Because you've never treated me like someone who needs saving. You've treated me like someone worth investing in. There's a difference." "A crucial one," he agreed softly. "You're not a project, Freya. You're not a charity case or a social experiment. You're..." He paused, searching for the right words. "I'm what?" Their eyes met, and suddenly the air between them felt charged with possibility. "You're the most real thing in my world," he admitted. "Everything else, the power plays, the social games, the corporate maneuvering, it all feels like a performance sometimes. But you're authentic, true to yourself no matter what they throw at you." Color rose in her cheeks, but she held his gaze. "Is that why you defend me? Because I'm real? I defend you because you deserve to be defended. Because you've earned your place here through hard work and integrity, not social connections or family names. He smiled slightly. And because watching you stand your ground against Cleo without ever lowering yourself to her level is honestly impressive. As she walked to the elevator that night, Freya's mind spun with the implications of what had happened. Cleo's threats seemed distant now, overshadowed by the way King had looked at her, the warmth in his voice when he'd called her extraordinary. She was playing with fire, she knew. But as the elevator descended, carrying her back to her ordinary life, Freya couldn't bring herself to regret it. Because for the first time since losing her studio, she felt truly seen, not as a charity case or a social climber, but as herself. And maybe that was worth all the danger in the world. Chapter 5. Unexpected Developments. The annual Bark Industries Charity Gala transformed the Metropolitan Museum of Art into a glittering wonderland. Crystal chandeliers cast rainbow prisms across marble floors, while Manhattan's elite circulated in designer gowns and perfectly tailored tuxedos. For Freya, it was her first major event as King's PA, and she was determined to prove herself. She moved through the crowd with practiced grace, her midnight blue gown flowing around her like water. The dress had been a gift from King, delivered to her apartment with a note that simply read, "Every executive needs the right armor." The fabric cost more than her monthly rent, but tonight she was grateful for it. The elegant simplicity of the design helped her blend in with the socialites while maintaining her professional dignity. "You've outdone yourself," King murmured as he passed her, looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo. "Everything's running perfectly." "The night's still young," she replied with a small smile. "Plenty of time for disasters." His low chuckle warmed her more than the champagne she'd been pretending to sip. "With you in charge? I doubt it." He moved on to greet more guests, but Freya felt the ghost of his presence lingering. Their relationship had shifted subtly since the confrontation with Cleo, becoming something deeper than mere employer and employee. She pushed the thought away, focusing on her duties. The evening progressed smoothly until Freya overheard a conversation that made her blood run cold. She'd stepped behind a massive floral arrangement to check the catering schedule on her phone when familiar voices drifted from the nearby alcove. "Everything's in place," Alexander Pierce was saying. King's business partner and oldest friend spoke in hushed tones. "The merger documents are ready. Once King signs tomorrow, the transfer will be untraceable." "And you're sure the offshore accounts are secure?" Cleo's voice was barely a whisper. "Completely. By the time anyone realizes what's happened, the company's proprietary technology will be in our competitors' hands, and we'll be very, very rich." Freya's hands trembled as she activated her phone's recording function, documenting everything. Her mind raced with implications. Alexander had been with King since the beginning, helping build Bark Industries from nothing. His betrayal would devastate not just the company, but King personally. "What about your precious assistant?" Cleo's voice dripped with disdain. "She's always watching." Alexander's laugh was cold. "The ex-maid? She's too busy making eyes at King to notice anything. Besides, who would believe her over me?" Freya's breath caught as footsteps approached her hiding spot. She quickly slipped away, moving through the crowd on autopilot while her mind processed what she'd heard. The evidence was clear. Alexander and Cleo were plotting to sell company secrets to their biggest competitor, using the upcoming merger as cover. She found a quiet balcony overlooking the city lights, trying to steady her nerves. The weight of what she'd discovered pressed down on her like a physical thing. King had trusted Alexander implicitly, even making him godfather to his young nephew. This would break him. "Freya?" She turned to find King in the doorway, his expression concerned. The last guests were departing, leaving them almost alone in the vast space. "There's something you need to see," she said softly. Inside his private office, she played the recording. King listened in silence, his face growing harder with each word. When it finished, he stood motionless, staring out at the city below. "I should have seen it," he finally said. "The inconsistencies in the merger paperwork, the delayed reports. I was blind." "He was your friend," Freya replied gently. "You trusted him." King turned to face her, his eyes intense. "You could have taken this information anywhere. To the board, to the press, to our competitors. Why bring it to me?" "Because you deserve loyalty," she answered simply. "And because I—" She caught herself, but not before King's eyes darkened with understanding. He moved closer, close enough that she could smell his cologne. "Because you what?" Freya's heart pounded. "Because I believe in you. In who you are, not just what you've built." Something shifted in his expression, the hardness melting into something warmer, more vulnerable. "When I found you in my room that first day," he said softly, "I thought it was chance. Now I'm starting to think it was fate." "I don't believe in fate," she whispered. "No." His hand rose to cup her cheek, thumb brushing gently across her skin. "Then how do you explain this? This connection between us?" Freya leaned into his touch despite herself. "I can't." The moment stretched between them, heavy with possibility. Then King's phone buzzed, a message from Alexander about the morning's merger meeting. Reality crashed back in. "I have to handle this," King said, dropping his hand reluctantly. "The evidence needs to be secured before he suspects anything." Freya straightened, professional mask sliding back into place. "What do you need me to do?" He smiled slightly. "There's the assistant I know, always ready for action." They worked through the night, gathering evidence and preparing for the confrontation to come. But something had changed between them. A line had been crossed, a truth acknowledged, even if not spoken aloud. As dawn broke over the city, King found Freya asleep on his office sofa, still in her gala gown. He watched her for a moment, struck by how much his world had shifted since finding her asleep in this same office months ago. "You've changed everything," he murmured, draping his jacket over her sleeping form. Freya stirred slightly. Nothing." He smoothed a curl from her forehead. "Get some rest. The real battle begins in a few hours." She caught his hand as he withdrew. "We'll face it together." King's fingers intertwined with hers briefly. "Together," he agreed. As he moved to his desk to prepare for the coming storm, King found himself wondering how this woman had become so essential to him in such a short time. She'd started as his assistant, become his ally, and now she was something else entirely. Something that made the betrayal of his oldest friend hurt less, something that made him believe in possibility again. The sun rose over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of pink and gold. In a few hours, they would confront Alexander and Cleo, changing everything. But for now, King let himself watch Freya sleep, memorizing the peace in her expression. Whatever came next, she would be by his side, and somehow, that made all the difference. Chapter 6. Hearts Unveiled. The fallout from Alexander's betrayal shook Bark Industries to its core. The morning after the gala, King had called an emergency board meeting, presenting the evidence Freya had gathered. Alexander's face had turned ashen as the recording played, while Cleo's perfectly manicured nails had dug crescents into her palms. Now, 2 weeks later, Freya sat in King's office well past midnight, surrounded by the aftermath. Legal documents covered every surface, the remnants of their efforts to untangle Alexander's web of deception. The merger had been halted, saving the company millions, but the emotional cost was written clearly in the new lines around King's eyes. "You should go home," he said, looking up from his computer. "You've been here since dawn." Freya shook her head, gathering another stack of files. "So have you. Besides, these partnership agreements won't review themselves." "Always the voice of reason," he smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. She studied him in the soft lamplight, noting the shadows under his eyes, the slight slump in his usually perfect posture. The betrayal had hit him hard, though he tried to hide it. Alexander had been more than a business partner. He'd been family, or so they'd thought. "Talk to me," she said softly, moving to perch on the edge of his desk. "You've barely said a word about it since that night." King leaned back in his chair, loosening his tie. "What's there to say? My oldest friend sold me out for profit. End of story." "Not end of story. You're allowed to be hurt, you know." His eyes met hers, and something in his expression made her heart skip. "Why did you really hire me?" she asked suddenly, surprising them both. The question hung in the air between them. King stood slowly, moving to the window. The city sparkled below, a sea of lights in the darkness. "Because when I found you in my room that day, you didn't try to flatter or seduce your way out of trouble. You were honest, even when it could have cost you everything." He turned back to face her. "I didn't realize how rare that was until now." "And now?" His gaze held hers. "Now I can't imagine this place without you." The words sent warmth spreading through her chest. She'd been fighting this growing attraction for weeks, telling herself it was inappropriate, impossible. But in the quiet of the night, with the city glowing beyond the windows and honesty hanging heavy in the air, those reasons seemed to matter less. "King," she started, but he was already moving closer. "I know all the reasons this is complicated," he said softly. "You work for me." The press would have a field day. The board would question every decision. But these past weeks, watching you fight for this company like it was your own. He paused, reaching out to brush a loose curl from her cheek. "You've made me see everything differently." The kiss, when it came, felt inevitable, like the final step of a dance they'd been performing since that first day. His lips were soft against hers, one hand cupping her face while the other drew her closer. Freya melted into him, all the tension and longing of the past months crystallizing into this perfect moment. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, King rested his forehead against hers. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted. Freya laughed softly. "Only weeks? I think I've been falling for you since you gave me a chance that first morning." He smiled, a real smile that lit up his whole face. "Tell me something," he said, pulling back slightly to look at her. "That night at the gala, when you caught Alexander and Cleo, why didn't you take the evidence to the board directly? It would have been a perfect revenge on Cleo." "Because revenge wasn't the point," she replied simply. "You deserved to know first, to handle it your way, and because..." She hesitated, then continued softly, "Because I couldn't bear to see you hurt like that in public." King's eyes darkened with emotion. He pulled her close again, kissing her with an intensity that took her breath away. This kiss was different, deeper, more urgent, filled with all the words they hadn't said. A noise in the hallway startled them apart. The cleaning crew, her former colleagues, were starting their rounds. Reality came crashing back in. "This changes everything," Freya whispered, straightening her blouse. "Only if we let it." King caught her hand. "I'm not ashamed of how I feel about you, Freya. You've earned your place here 100 times over. The board can deal with it. You're the best assistant I've ever had. And after what happened with Alexander, they know your loyalty is beyond question." She studied him in the dim light. This man who had changed her life in so many ways. "Are you sure about this? About us?" His answer was another kiss, softer this time, but no less meaningful. I've never been more sure of anything. They worked late into the night, but something had shifted between them. Their professional dynamic remained. Freya was still incredibly good at her job, and King still demanded excellence. But now there were stolen glances, subtle touches, moments when the rest of the world fell away. As dawn approached, King found Freya asleep on his office sofa again, case files clutched to her chest. He smiled, remembering that first morning when he'd found her in his private quarters. Who could have guessed that what seemed like a disaster would turn out to be the best thing that ever happened to him? He draped his jacket over her sleeping form, brushing a kiss against her forehead. Outside, the city was waking up, another day of meetings and decisions ahead. But for now, in this quiet moment, King allowed himself to simply watch her sleep and marvel at how love could sneak up on you in the most unexpected ways. The sun rose over Manhattan, painting the sky in shades of promise. Everything had changed, yet somehow it felt exactly right. They would face the challenges together, the board's questions, the media's speculation, the inevitable gossip. But as King watched Freya stir slightly in her sleep, he knew that some things were worth fighting for. This was just the beginning of their story, and he couldn't wait to see where it would lead. Chapter 7. Shattered Glass. The morning headlines hit like a tsunami. Every major newspaper, tabloid and gossip site blazed with the same story. Bark Industries, CEO in love, nest scandal with former maid. From cleaning lady to corner office, the gold digger who seduced a billionaire. Sleeping her way to the top, inside King Bark's office, romance. Freya stared at the newspapers spread across her desk, each headline more sensational than the last. The photos were everywhere. Stolen moments captured through office windows, security camera stills leaked to the press, and most damaging of all, a crystal-clear shot of their kiss in King's office the night after the gala. She knew immediately who was behind it. Cleo's revenge was as elegant as it was devastating. Unable to destroy King through Alexander's betrayal, she'd found another way to hurt him, by destroying the reputation of the woman he loved. The story they'd crafted was brutal in its simplicity. Ambitious cleaning lady seduces billionaire CEO, orchestrates the downfall of his closest friend and business partner, all while sleeping her way into a cushy executive position. The tabloids had run wild with it, digging up every detail of Freya's past and twisting it to fit their narrative. Her phone hadn't stopped buzzing since dawn. Old friends from the dance studio, former students' parents, even her landlord. Everyone wanted to know if it was true. The worst were the anonymous messages, filled with slurs and accusations that made her stomach turn. The elevator dinged, and Freya's heart clenched as King strode onto the floor. He looked impeccable as always in a charcoal suit, but she could see the tension in his jaw, the barely contained fury in his movements. "My office," he said as he passed her desk. It wasn't a request. Inside, he closed the door and immediately pulled her into his arms. "I'm so sorry," he murmured into her hair. "The PR team is already working on damage control." Freya allowed herself a moment to lean into his strength before pulling away. "It's not your fault. We knew this could happen." "No, we knew there would be speculation. This," he gestured to the newspapers, "this is character assassination, and I know exactly who's behind it." "Cleo," Freya nodded. "She couldn't destroy you through Alexander, so she's trying another way." King's expression darkened. "I'll handle her. The legal team is already preparing." "No!" Freya's voice was firm. "That's exactly what she wants. A public fight that keeps this story in the headlines for weeks. So we just let her get away with it?" The frustration in his voice was palpable. "We'd be smarter than her." Freya moved to the window, watching the city below. How many of those people were reading about her right now, judging her without knowing the truth? "The board meeting is in an hour. They'll want answers. King came to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. Let them ask their questions. We have nothing to hide, don't we? She turned to face him. The timing of my promotion, the coincidence of Alexander's downfall right after we became closer. It looks bad, King. Really bad. Since when do you care what things look like? His fingers brushed her cheek. The Freya I know cares about what's true. The Freya you know also cares about this company. She caught his hand, holding it against her face for a moment before stepping back. Your reputation, everything you've built, it's at risk because of me. Understanding dawned in his eyes. Number, don't even think about it. We have to be realistic. Realistic. His voice rose slightly. You want to talk realistic? Fine. The realistic truth is that you're the best assistant I've ever had. You caught Alexander's betrayal not because we were involved, but because you're brilliant at your job. The realistic truth is that I'm a better CEO, a better man, with you by my side. Tears threatened, but Freya held them back. And what about the realistic truth that every business deal you make from now on will be tainted by this? That people will always whisper that you lost objectivity because you were sleeping with your assistant? Let them whisper. King moved closer again, his eyes intense. I've spent my entire life building this company based on what other people thought was proper, what looked good to the board and the shareholders. For once, I want something just because it's real. The passion in his voice made her heart ache. King ... A knock at the door interrupted them. Mr. Bark, the board is assembling early. They're requesting your immediate presence. King's jaw tightened. Tell them I'll be there shortly. And Ms. Ruby, they've asked for her as well. Freya straightened her spine, professional mask sliding into place. We should go. Wait. King caught her arm as she moved toward the door. Promise me you won't make any decisions without talking to me first. She met his gaze steadily. I promise to do what's best for everyone involved. His eyes narrowed. That's not what I asked. It's the best I can give right now. The board meeting was exactly as brutal as Freya had expected. 20 pairs of eyes scrutinized her as she took her seat, their judgment palpable in the air. King sat at the head of the table, every inch the powerful CEO, but she could see the tension in his shoulders. Mr. Bark, the board chairman began, I think we all understand that personal relationships are complex. But the timing of these revelations, coming so soon after Mr. Pierce's unfortunate departure, if you're implying that Ms. Ruby's accusations against Alexander were personally motivated, King's voice was deadly calm, I suggest you review the evidence again. The financial trails are quite clear. Nevertheless, another board member cut in, the appearance of impropriety, the appearance? King's laugh was cold. Where was this concern for appearances when Alexander was selling company secrets? When he was betraying years of trust for profit? Ms. Ruby saved this company millions. She did her job with integrity and intelligence, which is more than I can say for some people in this room who were too blind to see what was happening under their noses. Freya watched as he defended her, his passion both touching and terrifying. Because she could see what he couldn't, the way some board members exchanged knowing looks, the subtle eye rolls that suggested they saw his defense as proof of their concerns. Perhaps, she said quietly, drawing all eyes to her, I should address the board directly. King's head snapped toward her, but she kept her focus on the board members. I understand your concerns. The optics of this situation are challenging, but I want to be clear about something. Every decision I've made in my role here has been based on what's best for Bark Industries, including the decision I'm about to make. Freya, King's voice held a warning note, but she continued, I hereby tender my resignation, effective immediately. The room erupted in chaos. Board members talked over each other, papers shuffled, and King's chair scraped back as he stood abruptly. "No!" His voice cut through the noise. "Resignation not accepted." "With all due respect, Mr. Bark," Freya kept her voice steady despite her pounding heart. "You can't force me to stay." "The hell I can't." He turned to the board. "If Ms. Ruby leaves, I leave, and good luck explaining to the shareholders why you lost 2 CEOs in as many months." Silence fell over the room. The board members exchanged alarmed looks. King's threat was not idle. After Alexander's betrayal and the halted merger, the company's stock was already shaky. Losing King would be devastating. "Perhaps," the chairman said carefully, "we should take some time to consider all options. Ms. Ruby, would you be willing to take a temporary leave of absence while we sort this out?" "That seems reasonable," she agreed, ignoring King's thunderous expression. "Fine," he bit out. "Meeting adjourned." The board filed out quickly, leaving them alone in the conference room. The moment the door closed, King rounded on her. "What the hell was that?" "That was me protecting you," Freya said quietly. "The company is still reeling from Alexander's betrayal. It can't handle another scandal." "So your solution is to run away?" He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. "To let Cleo win?" "My solution is to give everyone time to remember what matters, the company's success, not office gossip." "And us?" His voice softened. "What about what matters to us?" Freya's heart clenched at the pain in his eyes. "If what we have is real, it can survive a few weeks apart. A few weeks that Cleo and her tabloid friends will use to spin more lies about you." He moved closer, cupping her face in his hands. "I won't let them destroy you." "They can't destroy me," she whispered, covering his hands with hers. "I know who I am. So do you. That's enough." "Is it?" The question hung between them, heavy with all the things they hadn't said. Finally, Freya stepped back, squaring her shoulders. "It has to be, at least for now." She gathered her things quickly, not trusting herself to stay longer. At her desk, she began packing her personal items, aware of the whispers and stares from other employees. "Freya." King's voice stopped her as she reached the elevator. "This isn't over." She turned back, memorizing his face in this moment, the intensity in his eyes, the way his hands were clenched at his sides to keep from reaching for her. "I know," she said softly. Then the elevator doors closed, and she was alone. The ride down was the longest of her life. Each floor that passed felt like another step away from everything she'd built, everything she'd found with King. But as the tears finally fell, Freya reminded herself why she was doing this. Sometimes love meant walking away to protect what mattered most, even if what mattered most was the man you were walking away from. The media frenzy outside the building was worse than she'd expected. Reporters shouted questions, cameras flashed, microphones were thrust in her face. Freya kept walking, head high, letting their accusations wash over her like rain. "Miss Ruby, is it true you seduced Mr. Bark to advance your career? Did you frame Alexander Pierce? Were you working with Cleo Hamilton all along?" She made it to the taxi she'd called, closing the door on their shouts. As the car pulled away, she caught a glimpse of King watching from his office window, a dark figure against the glass. "Where to?" the driver asked. Freya closed her eyes, remembering the warmth of King's hands on her face, the passion in his voice as he defended her. "Brooklyn," she said quietly. "Take me home." The taxi merged into traffic, carrying her away from the gleaming tower that had changed her life. Behind her, the Manhattan skyline sparkled in the morning sun, beautiful and untouchable as ever, just like the man she'd left behind. Chapter 8. Dancing in the Dark. For a month, Freya threw herself into her work at the diner, ignoring the ache in her chest that grew stronger with each passing day. The media circus had finally begun to die down, though the occasional photographer still lurked outside her apartment building, hoping to catch something scandalous. The diner's regular customers had become fiercely protective, chasing away reporters and refusing to answer questions about her. Tonight, the usual crowd filled the booths, truck drivers, night shift workers, and insomniacs seeking refuge in endless cups of coffee. "Order up!" Joey, the cook, called through the service window. "And Freya, honey, you've got another one." She turned to find a fresh bouquet of roses being delivered, the fourth this week. Like the others, she knew exactly who they were from. The card would read simply, "I miss you. K." "Your billionaire's persistent, I'll give him that." Maria, the other waitress, winked as she passed. Freya managed a small smile, but her heart clenched. She hadn't spoken to King since walking out of Bark Industries, though not for lack of his trying. Besides the flowers, there had been calls, texts, even a heartfelt letter that she'd read so many times the paper was worn at the creases. The bell above the door chimed, and Freya's breath caught. King stood in the entrance, looking somehow both out of place and completely at home in his perfectly tailored suit. Their eyes met across the diner, and the world seemed to stop. "Well," Maria muttered, "speak of the devil." King moved toward the counter with that fluid grace she remembered so well, settling onto a stool as if he belonged there. "Coffee, Black," he said, then added softly, "Hello, Freya." She poured his coffee with steady hands, proud that her voice remained even. "You shouldn't be here." "Probably not," he agreed, watching her over the rim of his cup. "But when has that ever stopped me?" The familiar half-smile tugged at his lips, and Freya felt her resolve wavering. He looked tired, she noticed, new lines around his eyes, a slight shadows beneath them that his usual perfect grooming couldn't quite hide. "The press can go to hell." He set down his cup. "You once showed me why dance matters to you. Now let me show you why this matters to me." Before she could respond, he stood and held out his hand. "Come with me." Every logical part of her brain screamed to refuse, to maintain the distance she'd fought so hard to establish. But her heart remembered the way he'd looked at her that first morning, the way he'd believed in her when no one else did. "My shift isn't over," she said weakly. "Go," Maria called from across the diner. "I've got this covered." King's hand remained extended, patient but insistent. After what felt like an eternity, Freya untied her apron and took it. His car waited outside, sleek and expensive against the worn backdrop of her Brooklyn neighborhood. The driver opened the door without a word, and then they were gliding through the nighttime streets of New York. "Where are we going?" she asked as they crossed the bridge back into Manhattan. "You'll see." They drove in comfortable silence, the city lights painting patterns across their faces. Finally, the car pulled up in front of a building in the Arts District. King led her inside, his hand warm against the small back. "What is this place?" Freya asked as they climbed the stairs. Instead of answering, King produced a key and opened a door. Light flooded the space, and Freya's heart stopped. It was a dance studio, not just any studio, but a perfect one. Hardwood floors that gleamed like honey, mirrors running the length of the walls, even a small stage at one end. Industrial windows looked out over the city, and a modern sound system waited to fill the space with music. "I bought it the day after you danced for me in that parking lot," King said quietly, "because I believed in your dream. The question is, can you believe in ours?" Freya moved into the space in a daze, her feet automatically finding first position on the floor. The wood felt alive beneath her feet, calling to her. "This is... why?" She turned to face him, overwhelmed. "Because you showed me what passion really looks like." He moved closer, his eyes intense. Not the kind that shows up in boardrooms or society parties, but the kind that makes someone work 2 jobs to keep a dream alive, the kind that makes them stand up to billionaires and society princesses without losing their integrity. King ... Tears threatened, but she held them back. "I've missed hearing you say my name," he admitted softly. "I've missed everything about you, Freya. The way you challenge me, the way you see through all the corporate games to what really matters." He reached for her hand, and this time she didn't pull away. "The company's stock has actually gone up since you left. Want to know why?" She raised an eyebrow, curious despite herself. "Because the changes you inspired, the focus on community investment, on arts education, on making our success mean something beyond profit margins, they're working. You changed more than just my life, Freya. You changed how I run my company." "The board is eating crow," he interrupted with a slight smile. "Turns out having a CEO who remembers there's more to life than quarterly reports is good for business. Who knew?" A laugh escaped her before she could stop it, and King's smile widened. "There's my girl." The possessive note in his voice sent warmth spreading through her chest. "I'm not your girl," she protested weakly. "No?" He pulled her closer, one hand settling on her waist. "Then why haven't you thrown away any of my flowers? Why do you still wear the necklace I gave you?" Freya's hand flew to her throat, where the delicate chain he'd given her still rested. She hadn't been able to take it off, even when she'd walked away. "Because..." She hesitated, then decided truth was all she had left. "Because even when I was trying to protect you by leaving, I couldn't stop loving you." The words hung in the air between them, and for a moment, Freya thought she'd made a terrible mistake. Then King's lips were on hers, and the world fell away. This kiss was different from their others, desperate and tender all at once, filled with a month's worth of longing and unspoken words. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, King rested his forehead against hers. "I love you too," he whispered. "More than the company, more than my reputation, more than anything they could write in those damn papers." Freya's heart soared, but practicality made her pull back slightly. "The scandal is old news. Cleo's latest attempt to destroy us backfired spectacularly. Want to know why?" She nodded, still slightly dazed from the kiss. "Because while you were gone, your old dance students started talking to the press, their parents too. Stories about how you gave free lessons to kids who couldn't afford them. How you stayed late to help students practice. How you poured everything you had into that studio." His smile was proud. "Turns out it's hard to paint someone as a gold digger when dozens of people come forward to talk about their generosity." "They did that?" Tears threatened again. "They did. And then the Foundation's new arts education initiative started showing results. Turns out the board likes positive press even more than they dislike office romance." Freya laughed through her tears. "Only you could turn a scandal into a PR victory. Only because of you." He brushed away a tear with his thumb. "You taught me that real success isn't just about profit margins. It's about making a difference." He stepped back, gesturing to the studio around them. "This place is yours if you want it. No strings attached. Whether you come back to the company or not, your dream deserves to live." Freya spun slowly, taking in the space again. It was perfect. Better than her old studio had been, but I can't accept this. "Why not?" "Because..." She struggled to find the words. "Because I need to know I can rebuild on my own." Instead of arguing, King's smile widened. "I was hoping you'd say that." She blinked. "You were?" "Of course." He moved to lean against the bar. "Because I have a business proposition for you instead." Freya crossed her arms, suspicious but intrigued. "I'm listening." "The Foundation needs someone to oversee its arts education programs. Someone who understands both the business side and the artistic side. Someone with experience teaching, managing budgets, and dealing with corporate politics. Understanding dawned. You want me to run the Foundation's arts division? I want you to help me make a real difference. He pushed off from the bar, moving closer again. And yes, before you ask, the board has already approved it. Apparently, your handling of the Alexander situation impressed them more than they let on. Freya's mind raced with possibilities. And this studio would be perfect for pilot programs, don't you think? The Foundation could lease it at market rate, of course, all very proper and above board. She couldn't help but laugh. You've thought of everything, haven't you? I've had a month to plan. His hands found her waist again, pulling her close. A month of missing you, of watching you serve coffee when you should be dancing, of knowing I let you walk away once, and I'm never doing it again. This time, Freya initiated the kiss, pouring all her love and longing into it. When they separated, she smiled up at him. Yes. Yes to the job. Or yes to us. Both. She rested her head against his chest, hearing his heart beat strong and steady. All of it. Yes to making a difference. Yes to building something meaningful together. Yes to loving you even when the world thinks we're crazy. King's laugh rumbled through his chest. They probably are right about the crazy part. Probably, she agreed. Then, stepping back, she held out her hand. Dance with me. His eyebrow rose. Here. Now. Why not? You have a perfect studio, a beautiful view of the city, and a woman who loves you. Seems like a good time to celebrate. King took her hand, pulling her into a simple waltz position. I should warn you, I'm better at corporate takeovers than dance steps. That's okay, Freya smiled, leading him into a gentle sway. I'm better at dancing than corporate politics. We balance each other out. As they moved together in the moonlit studio, Freya felt the last pieces of her world clicking into place. This wasn't the future she'd imagined when she'd first taken that cleaning job, but somehow it was better. Because she hadn't just found success or love, she'd found both, and in the process, she'd found herself. What are you thinking about? King murmured against her hair. How sometimes the biggest mistakes turn out to be the best things that ever happened to us. His arms tightened around her, like falling asleep in a billionaire's private quarters. Exactly like that. She looked up at him, heart full of love. Though I still maintain it was an accident, and I still maintain it was fate. He kissed her softly. Either way, I'm grateful for it. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance, a new day was dawning. But here, in this perfect moment, Freya and King just held each other and danced, two hearts beating in perfect time, two worlds becoming one in a dance of their own making. Chapter 9. Trust Falls. I don't want to be your charity case, Freya insisted, standing in the middle of her new office at the Bark Foundation. The space was elegant but understated, with views of Central Park that still took her breath away. You're not charity. You're my partner, King countered, leaning against her desk. In every sense of the word, if you'll let me prove it. 2 weeks had passed since their reconciliation in the dance studio, and they were still finding their footing. In this new dynamic, Freya was determined to prove herself in her new role, while King struggled to balance his protective instincts with respecting her independence. Then, let me do this my way, she said, gesturing to the pile of grant proposals on her desk. If we're going to make the Arts Education Initiative work, it needs to be based on merit, not just because you want to make me happy. King's expression softened. Have I mentioned today how much I love watching you fight for what you believe in? Flattery will get you nowhere, Mr. Bark, she replied, but her smile betrayed her. Really? It seemed to work pretty well last night. Color rose in her cheeks as she remembered their dinner date. how they'd stayed at the restaurant long after closing, talking about dreams and plans until the staff had practically pushed them out. They were taking things slowly this time, rebuilding their relationship on stronger foundations. "Focus," she chided, but stepped closer to straighten his tie. "We have the board presentation this afternoon. Are you ready to support my recommendations?" He caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Always, though I still think you're being too conservative with the budget." "Better to start small and prove the concept," she argued. "Show them real results before asking for more funding. See, this is why you're perfect for this job." His pride in her was evident. "You understand both the business side and the human side." Their eyes met, and for a moment the rest of the world fell away. Then Freya's intercom buzzed, breaking the spell. "Ms. Ruby, your 10 o'clock is here." "Back to work," she said softly, stepping back. King nodded, professional mask sliding into place. "Dinner tonight?" "If the board meeting goes well." "When?" he corrected. "Not if." She watched him leave, marveling at how different things felt this time around. There was still passion, still that electric connection between them, but now it was tempered with understanding and mutual respect. The rest of the morning passed in a blur of meetings and preparations. Freya had insisted on interviewing every dance instructor personally for the pilot program, wanting to ensure they shared her vision for making arts education accessible to all. During lunch, she slipped away to the studio. It had become her sanctuary, a place to clear her mind when the corporate world felt overwhelming. Today, she found King already there, watching a group of young students practice. "Shouldn't you be preparing for the board meeting?" she asked, coming to stand beside him. "I am," he gestured to the children. "This is what we're fighting for, isn't it? The chance to give kids like this a real shot at their dreams." Freya's heart swelled as she watched one little girl nail a particularly difficult turn. "They're amazing, aren't they? Raw talent just waiting to be nurtured." "Like someone else I know," he said softly. She turned to find him watching her instead of the dancers, his eyes full of love and pride. "I had help," she reminded him. "Teachers who believed in me, people who gave me chances. And now you're doing the same for them." He took her hand, squeezing gently. "This is what real success looks like, Freya. Not just numbers on a spreadsheet, but actual lives changed." The board meeting that afternoon was a triumph. Freya presented her plans with quiet confidence, laying out clear metrics for success and realistic budgets. When she finished, even the most skeptical board members were nodding in approval. "I think we can all agree," the chairman said, "that Ms. Ruby's vision for the Foundation's future is both ambitious and achievable. The vote to approve the expanded funding is unanimous." Later, celebrating over dinner in King's penthouse, Freya finally allowed herself to relax. "I still can't quite believe it's real," she admitted, curled up beside him on the balcony sofa. "Believe it." He pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple. "You earned this, all of it." "We earned it," she corrected. "I couldn't have done any of this without you believing in me." "You would have found a way," he said with certainty. "That's who you are, someone who never gives up on their dreams." Freya turned to face him fully. "You're part of those dreams now, you know that, right?" His answer was a kiss that started soft but quickly deepened, filled with all the love and pride he felt for her. When they finally broke apart, both slightly breathless, he rested his forehead against hers. "Move in with me," he said suddenly. Freya pulled back slightly, surprised. "What?" "Move in with me," he repeated. "I know we said we'd take things slowly this time, but I love you. I want to fall asleep beside you every night and wake up with you every morning. I want to watch you dance in our living room and argue about foundation budgets over breakfast. King, she hesitated, but he pressed on. We can keep your apartment if you want a backup plan. I know trust takes time to rebuild, but Freya, these past months have shown me what really matters in life. And what matters to me is you. She studied his face in the moonlight, seeing the vulnerability beneath his usual confident exterior. This was the king few people got to see, the man who felt deeply, who wanted to make a difference in the world. Yes, she whispered. His eyes lit up. Yes, yes. She kissed him softly, because you're what matters to me too. As they sat together under the stars, planning their future, Freya marveled at how far they'd come. From that first morning when she'd fallen asleep in his private quarters to now, building a life and a legacy together. King wrapped his arm around her more tightly as a cool breeze swept across the balcony. What are you thinking about? How sometimes the scariest leaps of faith turn out to be the best decisions we ever make. He smiled, understanding in his eyes, like trusting a sleeping beauty who turned your world upside down. Exactly like that. She snuggled closer, content. Though I still maintain it was an accident. And I still maintain it was destiny. He kissed her hair. Either way, I'm grateful for it every day. Below them, the city sparkled like a sea of stars, full of endless possibilities. But here, in this moment, they had everything they needed: love, trust, and the chance to make their dreams reality. Together. Chapter 10. Society's Storm. The annual Bark Industries charity ball had transformed the Metropolitan Museum of Art into a glittering wonderland once again. But this year was different. This year, Freya wasn't organizing from the shadows. She was attending as King's date, and more importantly, as the director of the Foundation's Arts Division. She stood before the mirror in their penthouse bedroom, smoothing the silk of her emerald gown. The dress was a masterpiece of understated elegance, custom designed to make a statement without screaming for attention. Just like her. "You look breathtaking," King said from the doorway, already perfect in his tuxedo. "And you look nervous," she replied, turning to face him. "Which is ridiculous, because you do this every year." He moved to stand behind her, his hands settling on her shoulders. "I've never done this with someone I love before, someone who matters more than all the society games and corporate politics." Freya turned in his arms, straightening his bow tie. "Then, let's show them what real partnership looks like." They both knew what awaited them. Cleo had already RSVP'd, and rumors suggested she would arrive on Alexander's arm, a deliberate provocation. The society papers were buzzing with speculation about how the evening would unfold. The drive to the museum was quiet, both lost in thought. As they pulled up to the red carpet, King squeezed her hand. "Ready?" Freya took a deep breath, channeling the strength that had carried her from cleaning lady to executive. "Ready!" Camera flashes exploded as they emerged from the car. King's hand was steady at the small of her back as they walked the gauntlet of photographers and reporters. Questions flew at them from all sides. "Ms. Ruby, how does it feel to go from maid to mogul's girlfriend?" "Mr. Bark, is this a serious relationship or just good PR? What does the board think of your romance?" They ignored the questions, moving with practiced grace into the museum. Inside, the whispers and stares were more subtle, but no less intense. Society matrons huddled in corners, shooting disapproving glances their way. Corporate rivals watched with calculating eyes, looking for signs of weakness. But as they made their entrance into the grand hall, something unexpected happened. A group of children from Freya's dance program were performing on the central stage, their movements precise and joyful. The crowd fell silent, captivated by their talent. "You're doing," Freya whispered to King. His smile was proud. "The Foundation's doing. Your program is the highlight of tonight's fundraising. Before she could respond, a familiar voice cut through the moment. Well, isn't this touching? Cleo stood before them, resplendent in blood-red silk, Alexander at her side. Her smile was sharp as a blade. The cleaning lady and the CEO, playing house and saving the world. How charitable. Cleo, King's voice was coolly polite. I see you're still clinging to the past. How predictable. Alexander stepped forward, his expression hard. You'll regret choosing her over loyalty, King. The board may be temporarily charmed by your little romance, but eventually they'll remember what really matters in business. You mean like integrity? Freya's voice was calm, but carried clearly in the tense silence. Or is that too old-fashioned a concept for modern business? Before either could respond, King guided Freya toward the stage. The children had finished, their performance to thunderous applause, and it was time for his speech. Ladies and gentlemen, his voice commanded attention without effort. Welcome to a new chapter in the Bark Foundation's history. The crowd fell silent as King continued. My father was a janitor, he announced, causing a ripple of surprise through the assembled elite. He taught me that true worth isn't in where you start, but in how far you're willing to go for what you believe in. Tonight, I'm proud to stand beside someone who embodies that principle. He turned to Freya, his eyes full of love and pride. Ms. Ruby didn't just transform our foundation's approach to community outreach. She reminded all of us what real success looks like. It's not about stock prices or society pages. It's about making a difference in people's lives. The room was utterly still as King gestured to the young dancers. These children represent our future, not because they'll all become professional dancers, but because someone believed in their potential. Someone saw past circumstances to possibility. That's what the Bark Foundation stands for now. He paused, his gaze sweeping the room. Some of you disapprove of my relationship with Ms. Ruby. You think love should stay within social classes, that boardrooms and ballrooms don't mix with dance studios and diners. But I stand here tonight to tell you that you're wrong. Freya's heart swelled as King continued. Real change happens when we break down these artificial barriers. When we recognize that talent, integrity, and passion can come from anywhere. Ms. Ruby has taught me that, and together we're building something more meaningful than mere wealth or social status. The silence that followed was broken by unexpected applause, starting with the young dancers and spreading until it filled the vast space. Even some of the society matrons were dabbing at their eyes. Cleo and Alexander slipped away, their power play forgotten in the face of such genuine emotion. But Freya hardly noticed, too caught up in the love shining in King's eyes as he turned back to her. Dance with me, he asked softly, extending his hand. She took it without hesitation, letting him lead her onto the dance floor. As they moved together, other couples joined them, but they were lost in their own world. That speech, she murmured against his shoulder. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. His arms tightened around her. Because they needed to understand that you're not just the woman I love, you're the future I believe in. Freya looked up at him, her heart full. When did you become such a romantic? When a beautiful dancer fell asleep in my private quarters and woke me up to what really matters in life. As they danced beneath the crystal chandeliers, surrounded by the elite of Manhattan, but lost in each other, Freya marveled at how far they'd come. From that first morning to this perfect moment, their love had transformed not just their lives, but an entire foundation's mission. The society papers would call it the event of the season, but not for the reasons they'd expected. Instead of scandal and drama, they wrote about love transcending class boundaries, about a new generation of philanthropic vision, about how sometimes the most powerful changes start with a simple leap of faith. Later that night, as they stood on their penthouse balcony watching the city lights, King pulled Freya close. "Happy? More than I ever thought possible," she replied honestly. "Though I still can't believe you told everyone about your father being a janitor." It's time they knew the truth. About him, about us, about everything. He kissed her softly. "No more hiding who we are or what we believe in." Freya smiled against his lips. "I love you. You know that?" "I know." His eyes sparkled with mischief. "Though I still maintain you planned that whole sleeping incident. And I still maintain it was an accident." "Either way," he murmured, pulling her closer. "It was the best mistake I never knew I needed." Below them, the city hummed with life and possibility. But here in this moment, they had everything they needed. Love that defied expectations, truth that transcended social barriers, and a future they would build together, one dance step at a time. Chapter 11. Healing Steps. In the aftermath of the charity ball, change rippled through every aspect of their lives. The press that had once hounded them with scandal now wrote glowing pieces about the transformation of the Bach Foundation. Cleo and Alexander faced legal consequences for their industrial espionage, their carefully crafted social facades crumbling under the weight of justice. Freya stood in her dance studio, watching a new group of students practice. The Foundation's arts program had exploded in popularity after the gala, with applications pouring in from across the city. But she still made time to teach, remembering how dance had saved her in her darkest moments. "Your form is beautiful, Sophie," she called to a young girl struggling with a difficult turn. "Remember to spot your turns. Find something steady to focus on." The door opened quietly, and Freya smiled as King slipped in. He'd taken to stopping by during lunch breaks, claiming the studio's peaceful atmosphere helped him think better than his office. But she knew he really came to watch her teach, to see her in her element. "Ms. Ruby," one of the students called out, "is it true that you used to clean Mr. Bach's office?" The question would have stung once, but now Freya just smiled. "I did. And do you know what that taught me?" The children gathered around, curious. Even King leaned forward, interested in her answer. "It taught me that every job has dignity if you do it with pride. That sometimes the longest way around is the shortest way home. And most importantly," she caught King's eye, "that life's biggest surprises often come disguised as mistakes." Later, as the students filed out, King pulled her into his arms. "The board made an interesting proposal today." "Oh," Freya tilted her head back to look at him. "They want to expand your role. Director of Community Outreach for the entire company, not just the foundation. They're impressed with how you've handled the arts initiative." Pride bloomed in her chest, but caution made her pause. "Are you sure? After everything with Cleo and Alexander?" "That's exactly why they want you," King said firmly. "You've proven that integrity and business success aren't mutually exclusive. Take it," he urged. "Not for me, but because you've earned it. You know this will start the rumors again," she warned, though her eyes sparkled with excitement. He smiled that smile that still made her heart skip. "Let them talk. We know our truth." The truth was that Freya had become more than just King's partner. She'd become a force for change in her own right. Her background in dance had given her a unique perspective on community engagement, while her experience climbing from cleaning lady to executive had taught her the value of genuine opportunity. That evening, they hosted a dinner party in their penthouse for the Foundation's major donors. Freya moved through the crowd with easy grace, discussing program metrics and future initiatives with the same passion she brought to her dance classes. "You've built something remarkable," an elderly board member commented, watching a video presentation of the arts program's success. "When King first promoted you, many of us thought it was just romance clouding his judgment, Freya supplied with a gentle smile. The man had the grace to look embarrassed. Yes, well, we were wrong. The numbers speak for themselves. Indeed they did. Under Freya's leadership, the foundation had expanded its reach tenfold, creating partnerships with schools and community centers across the city. More importantly, they were seeing real results. Improved academic performance, increased student engagement, even rising attendance rates in participating schools. Later that night, after the last guest had left, Freya kicked off her heels and curled up on their balcony sofa. King joined her, loosening his tie. "Penny, for your thoughts," he asked, pulling her close. "I was thinking about that first morning," she admitted. "How terrified I was when you found me in your room. If someone had told me then where we'd end up, you wouldn't have believed them." His voice held amusement. "I would have thought they were crazy." She turned to face him fully. "But now I can't imagine any other path." King's expression softened. "Neither can I, though I still maintain you planned the whole thing. And I still maintain it was an accident. A beautiful accident," he murmured, pulling her in for a kiss. When they broke apart, Freya rested her head on his shoulder, watching the city lights twinkle below. "What happens now?" "Now?" King's voice was thoughtful. "Now we keep building. The foundation, the company, our life together, all of it. But most importantly," he tilted her face up to his, "we keep dancing. Even though you still have 2 left feet," she teased. "Hey, I've improved." He stood, pulling her up with him. "Here, let me show you." In the privacy of their balcony, under a canopy of stars, King led Freya in a surprisingly graceful waltz. She had to admit, he had improved. Though whether from their private lessons or from learning to trust in their partnership, she wasn't sure. "See," he said proudly as they swayed together, "I can follow your lead sometimes." "And I can follow yours," she replied softly. "That's what makes us work." The truth of it settled around them like a warm embrace. They had found their rhythm, personally and professionally, creating a dance that was uniquely their own. It wasn't always perfect. They still argued about business strategies, still had to navigate the complex waters of their public life, but it was real and true, and theirs. The next morning, Freya stood in her new office, preparing for her first meeting as Director of Community Outreach. The view of Manhattan spread out before her, but her eyes were drawn to a small framed photo on her desk. It showed her and King at the gala, dancing together, both laughing at some private joke. A knock at her door interrupted her thoughts. King stood there, coffee in hand, looking every inch the powerful CEO, but with that special softness in his eyes that was only for her. "Ready to change the world?" he asked, setting the coffee on her desk. Freya smiled, straightening her shoulders. "With you? Always." As they walked together to the boardroom, their steps perfectly in sync, Freya marveled at how life's greatest gifts often came wrapped in the most unexpected packages. A cleaning job that became a career, a mistake that became destiny, a love that became a legacy, and this was just the beginning. Chapter 12. Full Circle. 1 year to the day after Freya first dozed off in King's private quarters, she stood backstage at the grand opening of the Bach Foundation Center for the Arts. The building was a masterpiece of modern design, featuring state-of-the-art dance studios, rehearsal spaces, and a magnificent performance theater. But more than that, it was a dream made real. "Nervous?" King's voice came from behind her, and she turned to find him looking devastatingly handsome in his tuxedo. "A little," she admitted, smoothing her sapphire evening gown. "This is bigger than anything I ever imagined when I was running my little studio in Brooklyn." He pulled her close, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "That little studio laid the foundation for all of this, just like a certain cleaning lady laid the foundation for my happiness." Before she could respond, the stage manager signaled it was time. King took her hand, and together they walked out to face the gathered crowd of donors, students, and press. Standing at the podium, King's voice carried clear and strong. 1 year ago, a twist of fate brought someone extraordinary into my life. Someone who reminded me that true success isn't measured in dollars and cents, but in lives changed and dreams realized. His eyes found Freya's as he continued. Today, we open not just a building, but a gateway to possibility. Every child who walks through these doors will find what Freya Ruby gave to so many. The chance to believe in themselves, to reach beyond what society tells them is possible. The ceremony continued with performances from Freya's students, their talent and joy bringing tears to many eyes. But the highlight came when King unexpectedly stepped back onto stage after the final number. "Before we conclude," he said, "I have one more dream to make real." Freya's heart stopped as he turned to her, dropping to one knee in front of everyone. "Freya Ruby," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you walked into my life by accident and changed everything by design. You taught me that love isn't about where someone comes from, but where they're going and who they choose to be. You showed me that real power isn't in corner offices or boardrooms, but in the courage to follow your heart." Tears sparkled in her eyes as he continued. "You fell asleep in my private quarters and woke up my heart. Will you now agree to fall asleep beside me every night for the rest of our lives? Will you marry me?" The ring he held was exquisite, a perfect diamond surrounded by tiny sapphires that matched her eyes, but Freya barely saw it through her tears. "Yes," she whispered, then louder, "Yes." The audience erupted in applause as King slipped the ring onto her finger and pulled her into a kiss that promised forever. Their students rushed the stage, surrounding them with joy and congratulations. Later that night, they danced alone in the main studio, the moonlight streaming through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "Happy," King murmured against her hair. "Beyond words," she replied, looking up at him with eyes full of love, "though I still maintain that first morning was an accident." His laugh was rich and warm. "And I still maintain you planned the whole thing. Admit it, you saw a lonely CEO who needed someone to shake up his world. Maybe," she teased, "or maybe fate just knew what we both needed." They swayed together in comfortable silence, their reflection in the mirrors multiplying infinitely like their possibilities. "You know," King said thoughtfully, "most people would say our story is impossible. The cleaning lady and the CEO ... Since when do we care what most people say?" Freya smiled. "We wrote our own story and it's perfect because it's ours." As if to prove her point, he spun her into a surprisingly graceful dip. "See, I told you I'd learn to dance properly. You had a good teacher. I had the best." His eyes softened as he drew her back up. "In everything." Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, and somewhere in the distance, tomorrow was waiting with new dreams to chase. But here in this moment, Freya and King just held each other and danced, their hearts beating in perfect time, their love story just beginning. 1 year ago, a twist of fate had brought them together. Now, destiny was leading them forward, hand in hand, step by step, into a future brighter than either had dared to dream. And they would face it as they had faced everything else, together, dancing to their own perfect rhythm, their love story echoing through the halls of their legacy for generations to come. The end. Subscribe if you loved.